Section 2. Conclusions from the preceding view. The view given may serve to discriminate the ordinance of the supper from other institutions of the gospel and what may be styled the common dispensation of grace. It is one of God's three witnesses, 1 John 5, verse 8, and as witnesses must always be distinct, though the testimony it bears be the same with that of the word and of baptism, it must be different from these two, either in the mode of testification or in other respects. By the employment of sensible signs, both it and baptism are sufficiently distinguished from the ordinance of preaching. These two ordinances of symbols agree in being seals of the covenant dispensation. Between them, however, the distinction is also sufficiently clear. It is strongly marked in their form and spiritual signification. In baptism, something is done upon the recipient. He does not himself make use of the symbol. The ordinance is thus adapted to its use and import, as intended to denote regeneration and to mark out the heirs of the promise, whether adult or children. In the Lord's Supper, again, something farther is done by the recipient, expressive of voluntary and active profession. Baptism, from its nature and import, cannot be repeated. The observance of the supper, as the grand ordinance of spiritual nutrition, ought to be frequent during the life of a saint. The vows, too, come under at the Lord's table, are peculiarly sacred and forcible. This arises from the manner and circumstances in which they are made. In the baptismal dedication our wills are not consulted, nor is it requisite they should, since our own consent is not necessary in regard to the obligations of duty. Here a footnote. As the reference is here to paedobaptism, what is affirmed may be deemed objectionable. It should be remembered, however, that we are naturally under obligations independent of our own will or choice. As creatures we are bound to serve and glorify God, whether we will or not. We are bound to obey Him. And in being born heirs of the promise, that by relation to Christian parents brought under the dispensation of the covenant, quote, I will be your God, and the God of your seed, unquote, or, quote, in thee shall the families of the earth be blessed, unquote. We are born not only to all the privileges, but also to all the duties of our holy profession. Still, however, our own consent has great weight in the mind and conscience. What we would otherwise feel reluctant to perform, we do cheerfully, when we consider that we have voluntarily pledged our faith for it. This is a great obligation, for it is self-obligation. We are bound to be the Lord's whether we vow or not, but if we have vowed or made a profession of equal amount, we are doubly bound, and the more frequently we have done so, the more evidence is here of a plenary consent. At the Lord's table, we, as it were, renounce all indifference about the matter, which cannot properly be affirmed of our subjection to the other institutions. At our entrance on the controversy relative to the observance of the supper, the question occurs, ought it to be placed on a level with the other institutions of the gospel? Ought all three witnessing ordinances to be conjoined in the stated and common dispensation of grace? As to baptism, an exception is made and admitted on both sides. It can be dispensed only when subjects are found to receive it, and there must be no repetition. But the supper, it is alleged, ought ever to be conjoined with the preaching of the gospel as a part of stated and ordinary service in the church. In support of this plan, attempts have been made to reduce it to a level with the usual dispensation of grace, as in no respect more solemn, nor to be discriminated from other institutions by any previous peculiar attentions. Particularly, it is represented as bearing no such marks of specialty as might indicate its being designed only for occasional observance. A very different conclusion arises from the view presented in the preceding section. Let us again candidly survey the institution, nature, and use of the supper. It will appear to be an ordinance that neither requires nor can properly admit of anything more than occasional observance. While it was honored with an institution in various respects, impressive and different from that of the other witnessing ordinances, it was, we have seen, appointed instead of the Passover feast. But the Passover was not a part of stated ordinary service in the Jewish church, and we have no indication from Jesus that a difference was intended in this respect with regard to the supper. To fulfill its ends in keeping up the remembrance of the death of Christ, or being a public sign that the atonement is made, and the promised state of privilege realized, there is no necessity for having the ordinance in constant dispensation. On the contrary, it has moved away from its proper sphere, and much of its impressive effect must be lost if, instead of occasionally recalling to mind the glory of our gospel state, and presenting to view the event to which all our privileges owing, it shall be made one of the common external privileges of the state. And here a footnote. The case of the Sabbath may perhaps be objected, but the Sabbath is only the time of Christian worship, not an ordinance of worship like the supper. And if the seventh part of our time be claimed by God, it was proper that the day which anciently commemorated the creation, or the redemption from Egypt and the Canaan rest, should now bear a respect to God's ultimate rest in the finished work of Christ, and to our rest with him in this here or hereafter. If, however, the Sabbath be the stated memorial or finished redemption, the supper, on this very ground, must be a peculiar ordinance, intended but for occasional observance. It is the sacred feast of the Christian Church, and designed to realize in visible exhibition the whole gospel dispensation, which is represented as a feast of fat things, or the marriage supper of the Lamb. Then, while that dispensation was manifestly intended for the stated spiritual entertainment of the people of God, the symbolical exhibition must surely have been meant for an extraordinary observance. To join it ever with the usual dispensation of grace would seem greatly to supersede that eating of the flesh and drinking of the blood of the Son of Man, designed to be the permanent exercise of faith in hearing the Word. Some difference was doubtless intended to be put between the constant public feast in the gospel and the sacramental feast, but that difference is much overlooked if both are placed on a level, or if the eating and drinking by symbols be not occasioned. We ought to bear in mind also that though the supper be an high privilege in its nature and references, yet the use of symbols is an accommodation to an imperfect state of the Church. The symbols of the Mosaic economy were numerous, because the Church was then in minority. Those of the Christian state are few, but that any appear in owing to the want of final perfection. As the shadow or profile hath vanished, the glass in which the very image is seen will also be removed. When that which is perfect is come, we shall see face to face. The ordinance of the supper is thus, as far as the use of symbols is concerned, somewhat like a relic of God's ancient method of training up his church. But to mark the comparative perfection of our state, as the symbolical ordinances are few, so they were appointed the one instead of circumcision, which could be but once performed, and the other instead of the Passover, an annual feast, an indication of their being intended only for occasional observance. Instead of all the other symbols, the carnal ordinances of the law, we were to enjoy the simple preaching of the gospel, the plenary and unveiled dispensation of spiritual privilege. And here a footnote. Hence, in enumerating the witnesses on earth, John denominates the preaching of the gospel the Spirit, 1 John 5, verse 8. It is the Spirit in opposition to the letter, the legal system and method of instruction, 2 Corinthians 3, verses 6 through 8. But in the gospel economy, it is appropriately the Spirit, even in contradistinction to the water and the blood. Baptism and the supper, for in these, along with the words which are the Spirit and life, John 6, verse 63, there are material signs employed. But what is the preaching of the gospel but the Holy Spirit simply, and without the intervention of any material emblems, testifying to us, dealing directly with our understandings, to the full disclosure of the truth as it is in Jesus? But if overlooking the design of occasional observance which coincides with the fewness of our symbolical ordinances, we make the supper a part of stated service, do we not, as it were, multiply the tokens of imperfection, revert it so far to the legal state of things, and endeavor to introduce and establish in the Christian Church, by that single ordinance, a permanent symbolical service?